Nothing. Nothing is more vital to your project success than effectively engaging with your stakeholders. Let me explain. Stakeholders are defined as an individual, a group, or organization who can influence and or is impacted by and or is or would be interested in a decision, activity, or outcome of the project. There are a couple key terms within that definition. Let's start with the term influence. In its most simplistic form, influence over your project means power. The power to compete for resources, the power to halt project progress, the power to hinder your efforts, or the power to completely kill the project. Interest means nothing more complex than interest. It's by understanding that interest is not equal awareness of the project, its activities, or the resources potentially required to complete the project that we start to gain an upper hand for our efforts. We typically fail to understand that power is simply that, power. Interest, however, can be either positive, they're generally supportive of your project and to some degree want to see it succeed, or it can be negative. They're generally hostile to your project and would like to see it fail. More on this in a moment. But first, we must understand there are two distinctly different types of stakeholders: direct stakeholders and indirect stakeholders. Direct stakeholders. These are the stakeholders we're typically quick to identify within our projects. They're the project management team, the project sponsor, and the internal or external client for whom the project is being undertaken. At some point within the project, we also need to remember the support groups we call upon for project helps. It's the indirect stakeholders we fail to account for through our planning and engagement that often derail and cause unforeseen issues within our projects. These are everyone else you can think of. If they know what the project goals were, would they then be interested in the project? These indirect stakeholders can and do include the media, regulators and regulatory bodies, company owners, managers, and staff. They're also your suppliers of project resources, the end user of the product you're making, and the greater community as a whole. Sadly, most of us tend to think that knowing who the stakeholders are in our projects is winning, when in reality, it's learning to engage with them effectively that will ultimately set your project up for success. So let's walk you through how to do so. Let's quit talking the theory of stakeholders and give you the tools you can start employing to better engage with them immediately. The Institute of Project Management has created scales using 5 data points anyone can use that allows us to quickly and effectively categorize our stakeholders, our risk levels, and more. 5 points for rating is key, as it allows a very high or very low rating, a somewhat high or somewhat low rating, and a true middle ground. This negates quite a bit of subjectivity within our planning and preferences and allows a more honest and thorough look at the operational environment in which you're operating. For our stakeholders, we're going to use the following 5 levels to the level of power a stakeholder wields over our project. Please note that a numerical designation beside each term is that will come into play very soon. Very high power, 5. This stakeholder can direct or have a massive impact on the course of the project and its success. High power, 4. This stakeholder has a major impact on the project schedule or budget, typically through its ownership of resources, and they also have a minor impact on our achieving the intended scope of the project. Moderate power, a 3. This stakeholder has a minor impact on the project schedule or the budget. Low power, 2. They can't impact directly the project, but they can have direct access to someone, but they do have direct access to someone who can. Very low power, 1. This stakeholder cannot directly impact the project at all. Let's use the same scale to rate the positive interest of our stakeholders. Very high positive interest. This stakeholder passionately advocates for the project and its outcomes and will be devastated or furious if the project fails. High positive interest. They are highly supportive of the project and will be angry or highly irritated if the project fails. Moderate positive interest. This stakeholder sees some positive benefit to themselves in the project and will be annoyed if the project fails. Low positive interest. This stakeholder sees some positive benefits to others in the project and will be disappointed if the project fails. Very low positive interest. If they were asked, this stakeholder would probably prefer the project succeeds, but they don't care strongly either way. Of course, and I hate to sound jaded by saying this, for every positive stakeholder within our projects, there are probably 2 to 3 negative stakeholders. So let's take a look at how we rank the stakeholders with negative interest in your projects. Very high negative interest, a -5. These stakeholders are openly hostile to the intended goals or outcomes of the project and feel joy and vindication if the project ends early. High negative interest, -4, believes the financial or social costs for the project are greater than the benefit the project brings. Moderate negative interest, a -3, anticipates negative outcomes for themselves from the project, and will be happy the project failed or was stopped. Low negative interest, a -2, sees harm to some in the project and would like to see it ended. Very low negative interest, a -1. If asked, this stakeholder would probably prefer the project didn't continue, but doesn't really feel strongly either way. Of course, you can edit these definitions to make them more applicable to your project, but the overall point is that you have a strong methodology through which you can rank those people with power and interest in your projects. Once you have all stakeholders ranked, you can best use a methodology through which to communicate with them effectively. To do so is much easier than you think. If we know the numerical value of the levels of power and interest your stakeholders possess, all we do is multiply the two to give you a score between 1 and 25. Just a heads up. Stakeholders with negative interest have a negative score overall that will allow you to easily differentiate them from those of positive interest. Now that we've identified the stakeholders in our projects and we've prioritized them by their levels of power and interest, we can best engage with them properly. This table shows a breakdown of the engagement recommendation for each stakeholder and is determined by where they were ranked and placed on the scale. For those stakeholders in your projects with low power and low levels of interest, positive or negative, we need simply to monitor them through their media to see if their level of interest or access to power changes. Let me be clear. Access to power does change and you need to keep an eye out for it. Someone may seem to you like a bit player one day who could wield power over you in the project's future the next. Don't forget that elections, promotions, and more happen, and keep a proactive eye on these stakeholders. For the stakeholders who possess high levels of either power or interest, but low to very low levels of the other, our engagement strategy is to inform them of all relevant project updates at predefined intervals. This, though, is part of the problem. We understand we need to provide status reports to our stakeholders, and yet we fail to plan to do so, causing more stress upon ourselves. Note as well, for each level of engagement recommended to the stakeholder, is advised you do all subordinate engagement strategies as well. So in this case, you would not only inform the stakeholder, you would also monitor them for shifts in their power or interest for your project. Next strategy. For those stakeholders who are ranked very high on one scale and only moderate on the other, we consult with them. This means we get their feedback on key project decisions that are relevant to this stakeholder. This is very important to highlight. It isn't necessary or recommended to get this stakeholder's thoughts or feedbacks on all project decisions, just those decisions relevant to this stakeholder. I've seen this level of engagement backfire more times than I can count because the very nature of these people is confusing to us. Someone can be passionately evangelical for our project, but doesn't necessarily possess the power needed to be able to support the project to the level needed. This isn't a bad thing. Far too often, it's just a fact of life. And yet we bring them into meetings and working groups and utilize them outside a level of their ability to our project. To be clear, with these stakeholders, you've already made a decision or the bulk of one. You can present them with options, but don't involve them in the decision-making process with you. You'll regret it. If you're starting to notice a theme here, being deliberate in what you do, that's for a reason. More to follow on this later. For the next group of stakeholders who exhibit on a very high level of power or interest and a low level of the other, we start to now involve them in our projects and seek out their advice. This group we involve are often mistaken with the next level up the scale of stakeholder engagement, collaborate. The difference isn't so minor as it may appear, though. Those ranked at the collaborate level exhibit at the very least a moderate ranking of either power or interest and a high to very high ranking for the other. With these people, we partner with them to arrive at solutions acceptable to achieve project success. I'll tell you this from firsthand experience. I've seen senior level project managers obsess internationally over where they should involve or collaborate with the stakeholder. Don't fall victim to wasting time like this. I know it's easier said than done, but go with your gut. The ranking scale is a living document, and you can always shift gears with your approach to the stakeholders. I'll be blunt. If you find you and your team have incorrectly categorized a stakeholder, change how you engage with them and move on. This is very rarely, even remotely fatal for your projects. Move on, correct your activities, and stop wasting time on the trivial. The final ranking for those rare stakeholders in your projects is empower. To put it very simply, leave relevant decisions to them and authorize them to make them. Here's the trick. If you're uncomfortable doing so, you've incorrectly ranked that stakeholder. I fully understand this is much easier said than done, as it took me a long time to build the trust and comfort with those on my teams to empower them. But once you have it, trust your gut and let these stakeholders help your project. By doing so, they're also helping you. Be grateful for this help and learn to appreciate it when it happens. The key, however, isn't in running the stakeholder plotting as an academic evolution for your project so you have another pretty chart to hang in your office. The key is in using this information to your project's benefit and allowing a greater chance of achieving the goals and outcomes you set out to achieve. You only do so when you deliberately engage with and review your engagements with stakeholders routinely and in a manner effective to them. Thanks for your time. I'll talk with you soon. Thanks.